I survived the dungeon, but I can still smell the coppery stench of blood dried into stone floorboards. When I pulled this yellow document out of a dust-covered vault in the Royal Archives of Vienna, my hands started shaking uncontrollably. This isn't just some old state paper from December 1610. It's an imperial decree that Habsburg officials were so terrified of, they literally ordered it locked away forever.
Before we dive into today's investigation, I want to be clear. The stories and theories shared on this channel are part of an alternative history exploration. We're digging into the unexplained, the unsettling, and the what-ifs of our world. Think of this as a journey into the dark side of history, part research, part legend. Watch with an open mind, but remember, this is for narrative and entertainment purposes only.
You see, the ink on this page doesn't outline a typical political treason or a border dispute. It details a total nightmare happening right inside the grandest castles of the Kingdom of Hungary. We are talking about a top-tier noblewoman, protected by insane wealth and what people believed was divine right, turning her entire estate into an absolute slaughterhouse. I turned the crisp, brittle page and felt a cold pit drop into my stomach. One question hangs over this dark, silent room like a heavy fog. How does the most powerful woman in the entire realm carry out systematic brutality for decades without a single soul having the guts to stop her? You have to understand, people knew something was deeply wrong, but money and title bought total silence back then. The royal clerks knew it, the guards knew it, and yet everybody looked the other way while young girls vanished into thin air. I hold this leaked file in my hands today, and I realize the terrifying truth. She didn't hide her evil in the dark. She did it right out in the open because she knew no one could touch her. Long before her name became a ghost story parents used to scare their kids, Elizabeth Bathory was born into a family tree completely rotten with power and madness. I was looking through old family crests and personal letters from Csejte Castle back in 1560, and her childhood looks like a horror movie disguised as royalty. Her relatives held massive titles, sitting as Grand Dukes and Kings, but behind closed doors they were losing their minds. We are talking about severe paranoid fits, random public executions, and flat-out sadism passed down through generations. To little Elizabeth, seeing someone tortured wasn't a shock or a tragedy. It was just another Tuesday. It was the natural language of high society. If you wanted respect, you ruled through total terror. Her uncles and cousins flexed their authority by casually destroying human lives, and she absorbed every single second of it. I found a note describing her early years, and it makes your skin crawl. She watched people suffer while wearing expensive silk dresses, learning early on that lower-class humans were basically disposable props. When you grow up in an environment where empathy is treated like a fatal weakness, your brain wired completely wrong from day one. You start to view pain as entertainment. Elizabeth didn't just inherit her family's vast fortunes and ancient bloodline. She inherited their darkest, most twisted mental wiring, and she was preparing to dial it up to a level the world had never seen before. At just 11 years old, Elizabeth was tossed around like a shiny prize in a high-stakes political game, getting engaged to Count Ferenc Nadasdy. I looked at the old architectural blueprints of Csejte Castle, where her massive engagement party went down, and the place looks like an inescapable prison. High stone walls surrounded by dense, pitch-black Carpathian forests that go on for miles. You have silk banners covering rough stone, child lords sipping spiced wine, and in the middle of it all, a young girl cut off from the entire world. She was ripped away from everything familiar and dumped into this cold, isolated fortress. That kind of sudden, extreme isolation does something ugly to a young kid's head. Deprived of normal friends or any real emotional connection, her mind started hyper-focusing on one single thing: absolute control. She couldn't control her own marriage or her political destiny, so she decided to control everything else within her reach. I saw court notes showing how she began bossing around older servants with disturbing intensity. When a child raised to believe she's basically a living god encounters her first taste of slight disobedience, something snaps inside. She didn't just get mad. She wanted total submission. Small mistakes by household staff weren't just fixed. They were treated like personal insults against her divine right. This wasn't just spoiled rich kid behavior anymore. It was the first real crack in her sanity, setting up a terrifying dynamic where any tiny slip-up from a servant meant walking straight into a living nightmare. While Elizabeth ran the massive family estates, her husband Ferenc was out on the bloody frontier earning a terrifying nickname, the Black Hero of Hungary. I was reading through surviving war logs and battlefield dispatches, and this guy was a total force of nature against Ottoman armies. He smelled like gunpowder, iron, and fresh mud, routinely severing enemy heads and sending them back to Csejte Castle like twisted little souvenirs. But when Ferenc came home from war, he didn't bring peace or quiet country life. He brought home the brutal torture tactics he learned on the battlefield, showing them off in the castle basements just to impress his teenage bride. I came across a secret diary entry describing these moments, and it completely flips what you think you know about her. Elizabeth didn't turn her head away in disgust when she saw these violent displays. She watched with this intense, dead-eyed curiosity. She wasn't traumatized. She was taking notes. War gave her husband an excuse to be brutal out in the open, but Elizabeth was realizing something far more dangerous. She saw how physical agony could break a person's spirit until they obeyed without question. Ferenc thought he was just showing his young wife how a strong ruler maintains discipline. He had no idea he was actually giving advanced masterclasses to a psychological predator. She took his military tactics and started tweaking them for domestic use, realizing that the castle walls offered total privacy to practice whatever dark ideas popped into her head. For years, Ferenc's terrifying reputation served as both a massive inspiration and a giant legal shield for Elizabeth's growing cruelty. I checked local magistrate records from that era, and it's crazy how his name kept investigators away. Servant girls who misplaced a sewing needle or spilled a drop of water were subjected to brutal beatings, but it always stayed hidden behind thick doors, brushed off as normal household discipline. I read old peasant letters, and you can feel the rising panic in the neighboring villages. Whispers were spreading fast about young girls getting hired to work at the castle gates and literally never stepping back out. But as long as the Black Hero was alive, no local judge or sheriff dared to knock on that door or ask a single question. He was a war hero, and his estate was off limits. This gave Elizabeth the perfect playground to test her limits without any fear of real consequences. She learned how to balance her public appearance as a dignified noble lady with her private addiction to inflicting pain. The power dynamic was completely locked down, but psychologically, she was relying entirely on her husband's shadow to keep the world outside. Deep down, her urge to cause harm was growing way too big for mere hidden punishments. The discipline was slowly morphing into pure, unhinged sadism. The only thing keeping her from totally exploding into unchecked horror was Ferenc's physical presence in the castle. So, what happens when the one man holding her darkest urges in check suddenly drops dead? In 1604, Ferenc Nadasdy died suddenly out on the battlefield, leaving Elizabeth a 34-year-old widow with total control over a massive empire. I found a transcript of an old court witness statement describing her private quarters late that night, and the vibe is utterly suffocating. Heavy perfumed oils mixed with the sharp copper scent of fresh blood filling the air. A young maid was combing Elizabeth's hair and accidentally yanked a small knot. Instead of yelling or slapping her like a normal strict noble, Elizabeth pulled a long silver hair needle from her desk and jammed it deep into the girl's flesh. As the maid collapsed onto the floor crying, Elizabeth didn't flinch, jump, or show a shred of panic. She just stood there staring at the bleeding wound with a calm, almost amused smile on her face. I read that detail twice because it marks the exact second everything went off the rails. With her husband gone, There was zero authority left to check her behavior. No one to answer to, no one to hide from. That single silver needle was the gateway drug to pure, unfiltered evil. It wasn't about punishing a mistake anymore. It was about the thrill of inflicting total damage on another human being just because she felt like it. The fragile line between strict noble discipline and chaotic sadism didn't just break. It completely disintegrated right there on her bedroom floor. With her husband out of the picture, the violence inside Csejte Castle turned into a daily industrial operation. I was going through leaked floor plans of the estate, and you can map out how calculated this became. Night after night, muffled screams echoed down the dark stone hallways, trapped behind massive oak doors built specifically to deaden sound. Elizabeth stopped hiding what she was doing from her staff. She treated her grand estate like a twisted personal theater, where she played the director and everyone else was a helpless actor in her horror show. I read depositions from escaped servants that described brutal winter nights where girls were stripped completely naked, dragged outside into the freezing courtyard, and doused with buckets of ice water until their skin turned blue. Other times, she used stinging nettles and heated iron tools to carve into them. What gets me is the psychological side of it all. Elizabeth was a highly educated, cultured noblewoman who read multiple languages and attended high society dinners. Yet, she found total personal freedom in pure, chaotic anarchy. She felt most alive when her victims were at their absolute lowest point, begging for mercy that was never coming. The castle wasn't a residence anymore. It was a private execution factory running on a daily schedule, and the worst part was that it was only getting started. The torture quickly evolved from sudden angry outbursts into super-organized, ritualistic experiments. I uncovered old inventory sheets from the castle basement, and the items listed on those papers read like a nightmare catalog. Specialized herbalists and select servants were brought in to help her design custom pain devices. We are talking about modified iron keys, heavy steel shears, and specialized binding ropes coated in sticky honey to draw biting insects. Elizabeth cataloged these horrific tools like they were rare pieces of fine art, taking immense pride in her growing collection. I found a testimony from a house staff member who swore Elizabeth would literally laugh during the longest sessions, finding dark comedy in the horrific reactions of her victims. She would crack jokes while girls pleaded for their lives, totally entertained by their suffering. This wasn't just anger or mental illness in the basic sense. It was high-level sadism turned into a sick hobby. But as the body count in the lower servant quarters began to pile up week after week, a massive logistical problem hit her estate. Dead bodies take up space, and you can only hide so many corpses before people start noticing the smell. She needed a permanent system to dispose of the evidence before the local authorities were forced to step in. But her total lack of fear made her shockingly careless about where she dumped the remains. To the Royal High Court over in Vienna, Elizabeth Báthory was still the picture of class, an elegant, deeply religious widow running a vast financial enterprise. I compared her personal letters sent to imperial officials with the court testimonies, and the contrast is downright terrifying. In her letters, she uses flawless, articulate language to discuss land property disputes, grain taxes, and political alliances with pristine aristocratic poise. But just hours after signing those official state documents with expensive ink, she would walk right down into her underground chambers to run another session of horrific violence. She moved between those two worlds without a single drop of guilt or hesitation. Psychologically, she operated with the unhinged confidence of someone who truly believed her royal blood placed her totally above moral law and human decency. She didn't view her servants as real people, so in her twisted mind, she wasn't actually committing a crime. She was just using her property however she wanted. How long can a person wear a refined mask of high nobility while literally covered in the dark stains of a dungeon floor? She thought her massive wealth and high-ranking family name made her completely invisible to the law. That extreme arrogance was her biggest blind spot, convincing her that no matter how messy things got downstairs, her gilded crown would always protect her from paying the price. By 1606, the entire region surrounding Csejte Castle was gripped by absolute, paralyzing dread. I read accounts from local town records, and the atmosphere in those lower villages sounded like a living nightmare. Peasant families would literally lock their young daughters inside small rooms the second they heard the heavy wheels of the Bathory carriage rolling down the dirt roads. People sat in the dark, watching through window cracks as covered wooden carts rumbled out of the castle gates under thick fog, hauling heavy pine boxes into the dark woods. I found records showing how local church priests were systematically bribed or threatened into silence, forced to write down fake causes of death like sudden fever or unexplained illness in the official parish registries. But you can only fake death records for so long before the math stops making sense. The local churchyards were literally filling up to max capacity with young, previously healthy girls. The soil was fresh with turned dirt every single week, and the villagers were starting to connect the dots. Grief was turning into pure rage, and small-town rumors were spreading across county lines like wildfire. Elizabeth was running out of local graves, forcing her to dump bodies into shallow ravines and nearby forests. She was pushing her luck to the absolute limit, totally blind to the fact that the quiet panic in the streets was about to turn into a massive political storm she couldn't buy her way out of. I stood in the dim, soot-covered kitchen quarters of Csejte Castle, staring at the written confessions of 3 loyal enforcers who carried out the Countess's darkest commands. Elizabeth didn't work alone in the dark. She built a tight, terrifying inner circle bound together by pure fear and sick devotion. I met their names in the leaked court files: Alona Joe, Dorothea Sentes, who everyone called Dorko, and a deformed young servant boy named Fixco. These weren't just standard household staff. They were the literal architects of her daily nightmare factory. They traveled into surrounding villages, promising poor peasant families that their young daughters would get well-paid domestic jobs inside the grand estate. They lied straight to desperate parents' faces. Once the heavy castle gates slammed shut behind those young girls, the trap snapped tight. The enforcers kept the basement fires stoked hot. They scrubbed the heavy iron tools clean between sessions. They dragged unconscious, bleeding bodies across cold stone floors. What kind of psychological grip did Elizabeth have on these commoners? She made them feel special. She gave them power over others. They thought helping the noble lady made them untouchable. They became willing monsters just to stay on her good side. They willingly destroyed their own local community to save themselves. But in a feudal world ruled by blood, accomplices are always completely disposable once the legal hammer falls. When I unsealed the black-inked record of 1606, I found a terrifying new name that sent a chill straight down my spine: Anna Darvulia. This woman was a feared local figure steeped in dark folklore and sinister village rumors. When she walked into Csejte Castle, the level of violence shifted into something far more systematic and psychological. I watched her profile emerge from old witness depositions. Darvulia took total command of the lower chambers, introducing extreme sensory deprivation and brutal physical discipline. She wasn't just hitting people out of anger. She was running calculated mind games. She convinced Elizabeth that physical agony wasn't just a punishment. She framed it as a mystical elixir. She told the Countess that consuming the vitality of young victims would preserve her authority and keep her youth forever. Elizabeth bought into the manipulation completely. Her narcissism loved the idea of personal immortality. Under Darvulia's dark guidance, the castle transformed from a place of messy, chaotic beatings into an organized shrine of suffering. The routines got longer, colder, and drastically more creative. But human bodies can only take so much, and years later, when Darvulia's own health began to rapidly fail, Elizabeth didn't slow down. Her addiction to terror was fully formed. Without her mentor around to direct the madness, Elizabeth's appetite for blood was ready to explode completely out of control. I found a handwritten diary page from the winter of 1608 that turned my blood to absolute ice. During the sub-zero months in the Carpathian Mountains, Elizabeth turned the castle courtyard into an open-air arena of pure terror. I can see the scene clearly in the court records. Servants drag young girls out into the freezing night air, completely stripped of their clothing. Elizabeth orders her staff to dump buckets of freezing river water over their bare skin. The girls are forced to stand totally still in the deep snow while the water freezes into hard ice. Bit by bit, their bodies turn into rigid human statues right in front of her eyes. Where was Elizabeth during all of this? She sat comfortably behind a glass window in her heated upstairs room, sipping warm spiced wine. She watched the slow conversion of living flesh into frozen stone like it was a live stage performance. She found genuine theatrical entertainment in watching people freeze to death. This wasn't just physical cruelty. It was total psychological detachment from basic human reality. She viewed other human beings like disposable wooden toys she could break for fun. But you can only freeze so many bodies before the sheer physical volume becomes impossible to hide. The ground was frozen solid, meaning no graves could be dug. The winter frost was holding dozens of corpses in place, waiting for the spring sun to tell their secrets. When the early spring thaw hit the ravines around Csejte Castle, the melting ice uncovered secrets that human eyes were never meant to witness. I read the horrified report of a local village official from 1609. As the snow melted off the outer ramparts, packs of stray dogs began digging into the mud along the cliffside. They dragged out half-eaten limbs and frozen human torsos that had been casually tossed over the castle walls under the cover of winter dark. The local peasants gathered at the edge of the ravine, screaming in absolute horror. The scale of the nightmare was finally exposed right out in the open. Rumors spread like wildfire down the mountain and reached regional magistrates. People demanded answers. How did Elizabeth handle the situation when officials knocked on her door? She didn't panic. She didn't apologize. She arrogantly brushed the whole thing off as a sudden outbreak of a local peasant plague. She claimed the bodies were just poor sick workers who died of natural causes. Because peasant lives held almost zero value in the feudal system, the local court hesitated to push further. But Elizabeth made a massive mental mistake. She believed her lie worked so well that she was entirely invincible. She convinced herself that no matter how many bodies piled up, her royal bloodline gave her a permanent pass to kill without consequence. Looking at the private banking ledgers from 1608, I realized Elizabeth Bathory held more actual raw gold than the King of Hungary himself. She wasn't just a rich widow, she was an independent economic superpower. I reviewed secret financial agreements where King Matthias II personally borrowed massive fortunes from her estate to fund his ongoing military campaigns against foreign armies. Think about that dynamic for a second. The ruler of the entire kingdom was deep in debt to a woman running a slaughterhouse in the mountains. This financial leverage gave her absolute, unhinged confidence. She knew local sheriffs and small-town judges were way too terrified of her money and legal power to ever place her under arrest. But psychologically, absolute financial immunity is the ultimate trigger for a predator. When you believe you can buy every judge, priest, and politician in the country, your boundaries completely vanish. Peasant blood was starting to feel boring to her. She had tortured hundreds of poor girls, and the thrill was wearing off. She needed a bigger hit of adrenaline. Drunk on her own invulnerability, she made a reckless, fatal pivot in her targets. She decided to start hunting inside the lower nobility. In 1609, A leaked enrollment list from Csejte Castle revealed a deadly trap disguised as a prestigious finishing school for young women. Elizabeth sent out invitations to impoverished lower gentry families, offering to teach their teenage daughters high society manners, dance, and courtly etiquette. I saw the letters sent back by proud parents who thought this was their family's golden ticket to rising up in the world. They willingly packed their daughters' bags and handed them over at the castle gates. But once those heavy oak doors slammed shut, those noble maidens met the exact same brutal nightmare as the peasant girls before them. They were dragged straight down to the cellar chambers, stripped and tortured. Elizabeth broke the one unwritten rule that held feudal society together. In that era, the ruling class agreed on a dark truth. You could treat peasants like livestock, but you never touched the noble bloodline. By shedding aristocratic blood, Elizabeth crossed a massive red line. She was so lost in her own sadistic fantasy that she genuinely thought minor nobles wouldn't fight back. When letters from the girls suddenly stopped coming, those noble families didn't just accept standard excuses. They started talking to each other, and their suspicion quickly turned into absolute, dangerous fury. I was reading through private letters intercepted in a roadside tavern, where grieving noble fathers gathered in total panic to compare notes. Every single family who sent a daughter to Csejte Castle was met with the exact same sketchy response from Elizabeth's staff. Your daughter caught a sudden fever and died instantly. When parents demanded to see the bodies or attend private burials, they were turned away at gunpoint by castle guards. That was the breaking point. These weren't helpless peasants who could be bullied or bought off. These were armed, well-connected aristocrats who knew how to work the legal system. They formed an organized alliance and began bypassing local courts entirely. They wrote high-priority petitions directly to the imperial seat in Vienna, accusing the Countess of mass murder. I held a copy of one of those urgent petitions, and the words practically scream off the page. The aristocratic shield that protected Elizabeth for decades was cracking from the inside. She thought her name made her untouchable, but she failed to realize one crucial detail. When you threaten the children of other powerful people, all class loyalty goes straight out the window. Deep inside the Royal Archives in Vienna, I tracked down the financial ledgers of King Matthias II, and the numbers tell a dirty political story. When the formal petitions against Elizabeth landed on his desk, the king faced a massive dilemma. On one hand, the public outcry from noble families was reaching a boiling point. On the other hand, the royal treasury owed the Bathory estate an astronomical sum of gold. But then, a dark political light bulb turned on inside the king's mind. If Elizabeth was officially investigated and convicted of high crimes, the crown could legally seize all her massive land holdings and gold reserves. Investigating her wasn't just about justice. It was an incredible opportunity to wipe out his massive royal debt in one single stroke. To handle this sensitive, high-stakes operation, the king appointed Count Georgi Thurzo, who happened to be Elizabeth's own cousin and the Palatine of Hungary. Think about the conflict of interest there. Her own family member was sent to lead the secret investigation. Was Thurzo trying to protect the family name, or was he setting up a massive political execution to secure favor with the crown? I held the yellowed transcript of Count Thurzo's secret investigation in my hands, and the sheer volume of testimony is overwhelming. Moving quietly across the countryside, his agents conducted covert interviews with over 300 witnesses. They talked to parish priests, escaped castle servants, grieving parents, and village doctors. Page after page details horrific accounts of systematic torture and hidden graves. But the most chilling piece of evidence mentioned in those secret files was a legendary item: a red leather-bound diary kept inside Elizabeth's private quarters. According to witness statements, Elizabeth personally recorded the name, age, and execution date of over 650 victims in her own neat handwriting. Whether that exact diary was real or exaggerated by investigators to build a slam-dunk case, the mountain of physical evidence was becoming impossible to deny. Thurzo realized he had more than enough proof to take her down. But taking down the richest woman in the realm required extreme precision. If she got wind of the investigation, she could use her private army to spark a bloody civil war. He needed to strike hard, fast, and under the cover of absolute darkness. On the night of December 29, 1610, during a blinding Carpathian winter storm, armed soldiers smashed through the heavy iron gates of Csejte Castle. I followed the tactical timeline from Thurzo's official raid report. The soldiers drew their swords and rushed into the main hall, met by an overwhelming metallic stench of fresh blood and damp stone. They weren't stepping into a quiet, noble residence. They were stepping into an active crime scene. In the entry hall, they found one young girl lying dead on the floor, her body covered in fresh wounds. Further down the hallway, another girl was barely breathing, clinging to life. When the soldiers threw open the heavy wooden doors leading to the subterranean dungeons, they found several more maidens locked in rusty iron cages, waiting for their turn. And standing right in the center of the lit room was Elizabeth Báthory herself. She wasn't running, hiding, or wearing a mask. She was dressed in fine velvet gowns, completely unbothered by the horror surrounding her. She looked at the king's soldiers not with fear, but with total arrogant rage, demanding to know why common peasants dared step onto her private land. I survived the dungeon, but watching veteran soldiers puke into their helmets is something that stays with you forever. When Count Thurzo's men dragged Elizabeth Báthory out of her active torture chamber, they didn't just find a crime scene. They found a nightmare that broke the minds of hardened combat veterans. Torch smoke cut through the freezing basement air, revealing one girl already dead on the stone floor, another bleeding out from horrific wounds, and several others locked in rusty iron cages waiting for their turn. Standing right in the middle of all this blood was Elizabeth, wearing a flawless silk gown, looking completely annoyed by the interruption. She didn't cry, she didn't run, and she definitely didn't apologize. She literally stood there with her hands on her hips, demanding to know why common soldiers dared to step onto her private property without permission. I looked at her arrest records, and the total psychological detachment is horrifying. In her mind, she hadn't done anything wrong because the girls weren't real human beings to her. They were just her property to break. She genuinely believed her royal bloodline gave her an absolute, divine right to turn human lives into meat. How does a human mind get so warped that it views pure, unadulterated horror as a basic aristocratic privilege? Within hours of the raid, Elizabeth's inner circle, Ilona Jo, Dorko, and the young servant Fixco, were dragged straight down to the dungeons of Bitka for immediate questioning. I stood in that interrogation vault reading the original trial transcripts, where the heat from torture fires cast long, twisted shadows across the damp walls. Under extreme physical pressure, the accomplices broke completely, spilling every single sickening detail of Elizabeth's daily routines over the last 15 years. They laid out the calculated beatings, the freezing water rituals, and the hidden burial grounds. They confirmed that hundreds of young maidens had vanished into the estate. But as they sobbed and confessed, one terrifying truth echoed through every single page. They were just hands following orders. Every single kick, every single needle, every single death was personally directed and ordered by the Countess herself. She was the mastermind, the director, the absolute dictator of the entire operation. Yet, while her enforcers were chained to stone walls screaming in pain, Elizabeth sat comfortably in her upper rooms, drinking wine and waiting for her rich noble relatives to come bail her out. When I turned to the deposition files of 1611, I found the legendary master ledger that historians still argue about today. Witness after witness testified under oath about a red leather book where Elizabeth had personally written down the names of 650 victims in her own neat handwriting. Think about that number for a second. 650 human lives wiped out for one woman's twisted amusement. Now, some modern historians claim the crown exaggerated that number to make sure they could seize her massive lands and wipe out the king's debts. But honestly, whether the real number was 200 or 650, the physical evidence pulled out of the ground was so overwhelming that it didn't even matter. Mass graves, scattered bones, surviving victims with permanent scars, and hundreds of grieving parents all pointed to one undeniable fact. Elizabeth Bathory was the most prolific female killer in human history. But as the trial date approached, a massive constitutional nightmare paralyzed the High Court in Vienna. How do you legally prosecute a woman whose family tree is literally woven into the judges, the generals, and the king himself? I sat in on the recorded emergency council meetings between King Matthias and Count Thurzo, and the political panic was palpable. Under Hungarian feudal law, high-ranking nobility possessed class immunity. You couldn't put them on public trial, you couldn't torture them for evidence, and you definitely couldn't execute them like a common criminal. If the king publicly executed a high noblewoman, the rest of the powerful aristocracy would see it as a direct threat to their own class privileges and start a massive civil war. The entire system was built to protect the elite, no matter how many bodies they piled up. The king was stuck in a brutal corner. He needed to satisfy the furious lower nobles whose daughters were murdered, but he couldn't break the sacred rules of royalty. So, Thurzo came up with a dirty, brilliant political compromise. They would completely cancel her public trial, keep her away from the executioner's block, but construct a private hell that would ensure she never saw the light of day again. They decided to grant her life, but strip away her humanity, turning her entire existence into a living death. In January 1611, a special high court convened to hand down sentences for the Bathory massacres, but the main suspect's chair sat completely empty. Elizabeth remained locked in her castle room, refusing to acknowledge the court's authority or answer a single question. I read the court log as her inner circle stood trial without her. Alona, Dorko, and Fixco were found guilty within hours and sentenced to the most horrific public executions available. The court ordered their fingers ripped off with red-hot iron pincers before burning them alive at the stake, while Fixco was beheaded and thrown into the flames. The public got their blood and spectacle, watching the lower-class enforcers burn to ashes in the town square. Meanwhile, Elizabeth sat upstairs in her luxury estate, completely untouched by physical flame simply because of her last name. It was the ultimate, disgusting display of aristocratic hypocrisy. The poor servants who followed orders were tortured to death, while the evil mastermind who orchestrated the entire nightmare stayed safe behind velvet curtains because her blood was royal. I looked at eyewitness accounts of the town square in Bitka on execution day, and the air was thick with the smell of burning wood and flesh. Thousands of angry peasants and lower nobles gathered to watch Alona and Dorko scream as the pincers tore into them. But nobody was celebrating. The crowd was screaming in absolute fury because they knew the real monster wasn't on that execution scaffold. They looked up toward the mountains at Csejte Castle, standing silent and dark against the winter sky, knowing Elizabeth was sitting inside untouched. The public demanded her head on a spike, but the legal system had made its final choice. Class immunity won over human justice. However, while Elizabeth thought her money and family crest had saved her from the fire, Count Thurzo was quietly finalizing a permanent punishment that was arguably far worse than dying at the stake. He wasn't going to spill her noble blood, but he was going to make sure she spent every remaining second of her life wishing she was dead. In the summer of 1611, heavy military wagons loaded with stonemasons and mortar arrived at the highest tower of Csejte Castle. I walked through the architectural records describing the construction, and it is pure psychological torture. Armed guards escorted 51-year-old Elizabeth into her private bedchamber, a single, windowless room with heavy stone walls. Once she was inside, the masons went to work, laying heavy stone blocks over the main doorway, sealing it completely shut. Brick by brick, the sunlight vanished from her life. They didn't leave a door, a window, or an escape route. The only thing remaining was a tiny, narrow slot near the floor, barely wide enough for a guard to push a chunk of bread and a cup of water into the dark. Her total isolation was absolute. Zero human contact, zero light, zero voices, zero touch. The immense luxury that defined her whole life, the silk dresses, the servants, the power, was compressed into a pitch-black stone box while she was still breathing. For 4 agonizing, unbroken years, Elizabeth Bathory lived inside the total blackness of that walled-up tower room. I checked the night guard logs from Csejte Castle, and the notes describe a mind completely eating itself alive in the dark. Late at night, guards standing outside the thick stone walls could hear her pacing back and forth like a trapped animal, muttering crazy, incoherent nonsense in Hungarian and Latin, or screaming violently at unseen ghosts. Stripped of her cosmetics, her fancy gowns, her wealth, and her helpless victims, her sadistic brain turned entirely inward. The absolute silence and blackness forced her to sit alone with her own thoughts for over 1,400 consecutive days. The woman who once held absolute power over life and death, who laughed while young girls bled on her floor, was reduced to a naked, filthy ghost shuffling around in her own waste in the pitch black. What goes through a psychopath's head when there is no one left to hurt, no audience to watch the show, and nothing to look at but total darkness? On the morning of August 21st, 1614, a guard bent down to push the daily bread through the narrow slot and noticed the previous day's food was still sitting there untouched. I read the captain's final dispatch report. Soldiers were ordered to bring sledgehammers and smash through the stone wall for the first time in 4 years. As sunlight flooded into the dark chamber, blinding the guards, they found 54-year-old Elizabeth Bathory lying dead on the cold dirt floor, face down in the trash. There were no dramatic last words, no tearful repentance, no priest giving last rites, and no royal funeral. Her body was quietly carried out in the dead of night and dumped into a local churchyard. But when angry villagers threatened to dig her up and burn her body, her remains were secretly moved multiple times under military cover. To this day, nobody actually knows where her physical bones are buried. She vanished into the dirt, leaving behind only a trail of blood and terror. Centuries after her death, pop culture took her story and twisted it into sensational vampire myths about bathing in blood to stay young forever. But when you walk through the decaying, hollow ruins of Csejte Castle today and look at the actual historical record, the original trial transcripts, the sworn witness statements, and the secret royal decrees, you realize something far more disturbing. Elizabeth Bathory wasn't a vampire, a demon, or a supernatural monster. She was a regular human being who was given total immunity, infinite wealth, and zero consequences. Her story isn't a gothic ghost tale. It's a terrifying psychological warning about human nature. It proves that when a human being is given absolute power and raised to believe they are better than everyone else, the mask of civilization falls off instantly, exposing the pure, unadulterated evil that can live inside the human mind.